When it comes to crafting an MTG arena, it can definitely be a daunting task. No matter how big or small collection you are trying to craft from is, whether it's creating cards in standard, historic, and whatnot, crafting can definitely be overwhelming, especially for a newer player or a player that returning to the game and they have no idea where to begin. Hey everyone, it's Scar TV, and in today's video we are going to be diving into my tips and to how I think and go about crafting in the arena. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here and want to know I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button and let's dive into it. When it comes to crafting, there's definitely a few things that I like to focus on. Especially being a newer player or a player on a budget, wasting currency is not a good feeling, and having an idea or a mindset going into crafting will help you along your way in arena from not wasting your currency when it comes to crafting particular cards. Typically, my priority list for crafting comes down to two things. It usually focuses first around lands, because without lands, most decks can't work. The next thing being, are cards multi-use? Are certain cards that I'll be able to use in multiple decks if I decide to scrap a deck I'm currently working on after I finish building and play, a bunch of games with it and move on to another deck? Is it something that is going to be worth my currency spending, especially while I'm very limited? So the first thing I'm going to talk about and let's focus on are going to be lands. Lands are broken into many different things, many different types. There's rares, commons, mythics, the whole nine when it comes to lands. Essentially, the way I like to think when it comes to ranking lands in a way is three things. Does the land come into battlefield untapped? What's the ability of the land that, I'm playing? And three, is it a card that's very specific or something that's a little bit more broad? Depending on what I'm looking for, let's just say the deck is currently behind me. This deck plays a multitude of different style of lands, and we kind of look into this and we are going to try to figure out whether or not these lands are worth crafting. The one thing I will say that this deck is Naya Adventures. If you haven't seen it, it is kind of a deck that's kind of like mid-tier, I would say, currently in the current standard meta, and on this particular account I don't have any of these cards. But the lands that this deck does play are, the pathway lands. If you haven't seen those, they're lands that essentially create two different colors. This one in particular creates green and red, and essentially if we use our checklist we can kind of identify whether or not this land is good. And I already know this land's very good, especially in the current standard meta. The first one being that it comes in the battlefield untapped. Two, it creates a mana source of a particular color that, we may need. So if we're looking for green mana, we can flip it on the green side. If we need red mana, we flip it on the red side. Overall, the only drawback is we can't, produce mana of the other color. So once we play it on the battlefield, and if we don't bounce it back to our hand, we can't ever make green mana with it. That's the only downfall to it. And it's very broad, so if we're playing a green and red deck, this card can be used in a green and red deck. So I would say I would recommend to craft this card, not just for this deck, but if you plan on making more green and red decks. Next card being in this deck is actually Fabled Passage. I know I'm blocking, I do apologize, but if you don't know what Fabled Passage does, it's just like a card called Evolving Wilds. Both cards essentially will search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped. The one benefit of Fabled Passage, the reason why it's a rare card, is that if we have 4 more lands on the battlefield, when that 4th land technically comes out after you search for it, so on turn 4 you can sacrifice this, play the 4th land, that land comes in the battlefield untapped, putting the slight edge above, Evolving Wilds with Fabled Passage. So this is another card I would recommend crafting, especially, in a deck when you're playing multiple colors. This card helps us find the particular mana that we may need. If you look at our mana cost in our deck, there's many things that actually cost double of a particular color. So this will definitely help us. This will definitely allow us to search our library for, that mana source that allows us to play something like a Great Henge, or something like a Khazad-dûm Mammoth, or Shatter Skull Smashing. It allows us to filter our lands the way we need them to play particular cards in our hand. On the flip side, to compare to, we have a different deck here. This one's Boros aggro. Essentially, this deck here is a mixture of dogs and a little bit of aggro. And this one is more on the budget side, so we're playing things that are a little bit more budget friendly. So this deck here plays something called Windscarred Crag. And actually, these tap lanes are one of my favorite lands in the current standard meta, just on the basis on the budget side, because they produce, either mana, red and or white, and you gain a life. I actually like these over the temples because I don't think the temples are worth the craft for being a rare land. Just to scry the top card of your library, I don't think that ability is better than this one. I think that it's kind of a wash in particular. Sure, it helps kind of, filter the top card of your library, but for a rare, I don't think the rarity, warrants the ability. If I'd say at best, it's probably a uncommon land at tops. But this land card's good for a player that's on the budget. Like I said, it only costs common cards. Common wild cards are a lot more common than rare or mythic wild cards. So it's a lot easier to craft a a set of 4 of these than it would be to craft a set of 4, let's just say, of temples. So this would be like your card you would replace a pathway with. Next, I have a set of lands here that kind of do various different things, and if we use our checklist, we can kind of understand whether or not this land is going to be good for a particular deck we're crafting. So the first land we have up is Savoy Triome. I personally really like Triomes. I know it's a little bit slower than playing pathways, but I like the Triomes because of their flexibility. One, it's a land. Two, the benefit of this one, it actually counts as a mountain, plains, or swamp in this particular Triome. It does also produce 3 mana, which I also think is a plus for the downfall of it coming to battlefield tap. And 3, I actually really like the flexibility of the fact that we can cycle it by, discarding this card by paying 3 mana. We can essentially draw a card. So in the late game, if we don't really need a land, this land has a little bit more flexibility, which I think is the reason why I like them so much, is that there's a little bit more flexibility compared to other tap lands currently in the meta. And I think the idea of also having a 3rd color allows us to play 3 colors a little bit easier. The next card we have here is Castle Ardenvale. Sure, Castle Ardenvale is another good card here. It's a card that comes in battlefield tap if we don't control planes. Depending on the style of deck, whether it's control or aggro, I actually think this card is actually fairly strong. In a control deck, we don't play a lot of creatures, so having 1/1s to possibly block our opponent or eventually overwhelm our opponent for playing a slower game can definitely be a good idea here. 2, typically most control decks, will be able to get the white mana in order to make this come to the battlefield to untap. And I think the idea that it has some late game flexibility, I think, makes this overall good, and it's worth the idea of it coming to battlefield tap. So if you're playing a deck that wants some extra creature pump, I would actually say Castle Ardenvale checks our list. Sure, it's maybe a little bit more specific, but I do think it's a good card to craft if you were going to go ahead and craft it. Next card here is actually a card that I would not recommend craft, and the reason why it's very limited in what it's trying to do. Sure, it doesn't come in battlefield tap, so it's an untapped land. Downfall is I think it produces colorless mana, which if you're playing decks that are very, we're trying to hit double red, double green, double white, double blue, double black, it's going to make it harder for you to hit those particular colors because it's producing colorless mana, which doesn't help us in that situation. And 3, if we look at the ability is very focused. So we can, for 2 mana and tap it, we can put a +1/+1 counter on target bird, cat, dog, goat, ox, or snake. So it's very specific. So if we're not playing any of those cards, there's really no need for us to play this land. And this is why this card would essentially fit in kind of more of like, if we're playing a very specific deck and we need this particular card, maybe craft it then. But there's still a part of me that would be like, I don't really think it's even worth crafting. Is getting that +1/+1 counter really going to make or break our deck? If it is, then maybe our deck is kind of a little bit fragile and needs a rethink of how it's going to work. I've actually never seen this played even in a Boros dog deck. Sure, maybe it's a good addition, but there's a lot of cards in it that play one or the other color, and if we don't hit those colors, it makes it harder for us to play those cards. So I would say this is one of those cards that is on that list of let's not ever craft it unless really, really desperate and we really want to craft, this land to finish our collection. I would say this is something, if you have extra currency, go ahead and do, but I wouldn't waste your currency if you're very limited on it to begin with. Now, the next thing we talk about here outside of lands are cards that have multiple uses. So when it comes to cards that have multiple uses, we're actually going to go back to our Naya Adventures deck that we have here, and we're going to look at particular cards in the deck and kind of see whether or not a card has multiple uses. So the first one I think that sticks out is a card that you kind of see everywhere, whether they're playing any red in that deck, and it's going to be Lovestruck. It's going to be Bone Crusher Giant. Bone Crusher Giant is a card that is very flexible. It's very good for its rarity. It's a 4/3 for 3 mana that if it becomes a target of a spell, it's the owner of that spell gets dealt 2 damage. And I think that makes the reason why, 1, this card is a very strong rare to begin with, and 2, the reason why it's actually very flexible is for 2 mana we can pay 1 colorless and 1 red, and we can actually at instant speed deal 2 damage to any target, whether it's a player's face, their creature, and the damage can't be prevented, which makes this card also very flexible in the sense that it's a nice removal spell. So this card does one of 2 things. It does removal, and it also, plays a creature afterwards. Sure, you can slam it down on turn 3 and get a nice 4/3 out on the battlefield, but, if you have the open mana on turn 2, you can go ahead and maybe possibly remove a pesky little 1/1, 2/2, or something like that, and it only costs you 2 mana. Now, on the other hand, we're going to look at a card that's very specific. So, Edgewall Innkeeper. Sure, this card is very good, and in decks that play green in a way, I would say Edgewall Innkeeper is definitely strong because it combines with a lot of things that have adventure. It is kind of a little bit more narrow, so if we're not playing adventure cards, this card's not very good. So it wouldn't work, I don't think, a blue deck or a black deck or a white deck unless we're splashing green to play more adventure spells. Edgewall Innkeeper is very specific for a thing. Sure, it's only uncommon, so it's not really, you know, burning a hole in our pocket when it comes to wild cards, and uncommon wild cards are kind of in that middle ground. You kind of get them every other pack or so, I would say, roughly. So, you know, you kind of get them fairly often. But if you aren't playing these colors, I want to go out of my way to go ahead and craft something like an Edgewall Innkeeper. Going through that again, we can also look at other things in the deck. Lovestruck Beast. If you're someone who likes playing green, Lovestruck Beast is actually a very solid creature in general. For 1 mana, we can produce a 1/1 token. So on turn 1, we have a play. On turn 3, we can play a 5/5. The only downfall is if there's not a 1/1 on the battlefield, Lovestruck Beast can attack. But for 3 mana, again, a 5/5 is actually a very strong play. Sure, there's a lot of removal in the format that can just remove it from the battlefield, but putting that pressure on your opponent very early, very quickly makes this card very good. So whether you're playing Adventures, whether you're playing Naya, whether you're playing Rule, Mono Green, this card is one of those key cards that are in most of those decks, or in any deck that's really playing green, because it's just a very large threat that makes your opponent have to deal with it. If not, they're going to get hit in the face pretty hard. Now, we kind of look at various other things. Sure, this deck is kind of comprised of a lot of very solid cards. Some cards are a little bit more situational because of the way the meta is, so I wouldn't say you go out of your way to possibly craft these particular cards. Also, other side note, if you are a newer player and are very limited on, you know, wild cards, if you pull a deck from online and it has a sideboard and you're playing best of 1, you don't have to go out of your way and actually craft these cards because you're not really going to ever play sideboard. The only reason why I would say you ever go ahead and craft these cards if you want to tweak the deck a little bit and actually add any of these cards into your main deck. Just on that basis of sometimes, you know, sideboards are built, you know, to shift kind of, you know, have a general, like, in a traditional format, you know, you start with like a, this particular deck, and then in a best of 3 format, you would essentially sideboard cards in to kind of filter your deck the way you want it to kind of play against the matchup you're playing against. In best of 1, you play the 1 match and you're done. So the only time I would ever use a sideboard is actually if you want to take something out that feels like it doesn't really fit in with the way the current meta is. Other than that, I would say just focus on the 60 cards and then, you know, eventually maybe work on a sideboard if you decide to ever play best of 3 kind of Magic. The other thing too, the way to figure out when it comes to meta cards are cards that are played quite often, is you can just look at, you know, various, you know, websites that post, like, you know, the top meta decks and kind of see these cards that are played very often. If you look at maybe the top 10 or so decks that are listed for the meta, you look at each one, you can kind of see, you know, what cards are kind of filtering in and out of particular colors. And then as you kind of, you know, do averages, if you see, let's just say Bone Crusher Giant in 6 of the 10 meta decks, that card's played fairly often and making that a very multi-use card. But if you see something like Lotus Cobra played in only 1 deck, it doesn't make Lotus Cobra very played card. It makes it more situational. So essentially that's the way I usually judge whether a card's multi-use. The other thing too, removal spells in general are cards that are used all the time. So every color really has some sort of, most colors have removal. So depending on the color, you know, it doesn't hurt to craft removal spells, because if you're playing those colors in other deck forms, removal spells are key cards to add to the deck. So this deck doesn't play things like Shock and things like that, because it has something like Bone Crusher Giant. It also has a card called Shatterskull Smashing, which kind of does the same thing, is we can tap X for it, and essentially it's our other way of removal. But when it comes to like mono black and things like that, you have things like Heartless Act, Eliminate, you know, Elspeth's Nightmare is another one I can think of. And, you know, depending on the deck, you know, red has a lot of burn, you know, deal damage to target creature. Bone Crusher Giant is another one. If you're playing a mono red deck, there's a lot of cards that can just deal direct damage to something. And like I said, you know, if you craft those cards, you're not going to fall back on anything. And I would always look at some meta decks and look at, you know, the key removal cards in the particular color you're looking to play. Even if you're not playing that particular meta deck, you'll kind of see some of the stronger, you know, cards that are good for removal. And just like land cards, as we kind of did in my example, you can kind of go through a creature and do the same thing and use the same kind of checklist and just kind of go over those 3 things in your head. One, you know, is the cost affordable for the deck I'm playing? If I'm playing multiple colors and I have no good way to filter my mana, can I play a card that costs, you know, 3 red mana or 3 green mana in a deck that plays 3 different colors? Most of the time you're going to say no, unless you have a way to filter out mana to make it the color you want. But, you know, certain situations call for different things. The other thing, too, is you look at the ability. Is the ability very focused? You know, just like the land card that we had that, you know, only works for dogs, cats, oxes, goats, and things like that. Something like, you know, cards and rogues, for example, they're very rogue heavy, you know. Sure, some of the rogues can be very good if you have other decks like, you know, Blue Mill in a way. There's some rogues there that can help you with Blue Mill, but a lot of those rogues just work in a rogue environment. So outside of rogues, a lot of rogues just don't work in other decks. Now, I'm kind of going over like kind of how I break down whether or not, you know, a card's worth crafting and things like that, giving you some of my tips and points on how to go about crafting. These next kind of few things are going to be kind of my tips for you being a newer player and or a returning player to Magic the Gathering, kind of how I, you know, if I feel overwhelmed or trying to find some, you know, an idea of what to do, these are tips going to help me kind of figure out that. So I think the first thing when it comes to Magic the Gathering, if you're a newer player, is one, you should find some sort of focus. These are all the starter decks for the most part. You know, each one bringing their own thing to the table of what they each offer. I would say first start here and figure out which ones of these you kind of like, what deck style, and then from there I would say maybe go online, maybe do some research, maybe kind of see what other decks in those styles. If you really like Golgari back for more, but maybe you don't not 100% about the bringing things back from the graveyard, maybe you want to play something like Death Touch. Like Golgari Death Touch is kind of currently popular. That deck is actually fairly cheap. And what I would do is, you know, maybe import a list into MTG Arena, kind of like how I have my Naya Adventures, kind of like how I have my Boros Warriors or Boros Dogs or whatever it is. I would say import your deck into MTG Arena. The next thing I would do about that is that MTG Arena will tell you whether or not you have the wild cards to craft it. So currently these two decks are sitting down here and they have this red lotus triangle on them. And that essentially means I don't have enough wild cards to craft it. As I kind of highlight over it, I still need two commons, 8 uncommons, 38 rares, 8 mythics to complete this deck. If you hover over to this top lotus, you will see that I only have 2 commons, 2 uncommons, 1 rare, and 6 mythic rares. So we're very far away from completing that deck. So sometimes you can, depending on the website, it will have a breakdown of what wild cards you will need, and you can kind of find decks maybe that fit that budget. The other thing I would suggest here is, you know, as much as you are here, if you select a deck and you had the wild cards, there's a button that would pop up. I think I'm actually blocking it, but it's next to the favorite button and actually say to craft all. The other thing we can do is if we go into MTG Arena, yet again, I think I'm blocking it, down by the done key, if we had the key cards and we had the wild cards, this screen wouldn't pop up and we'd complete the deck and it would auto-complete the particular cards we're missing. So those are 2 ways to actually craft cards that you're looking for. Another thing I would give a tip on, if you want to create your own brew or your own thing and you're not really sure what you have, you can always go up to the top right hand corner here and click the craft. It will then essentially bring up all the cards that you have and don't have, and these little squares up here will tell you how many of those cards you have in your inventory. So essentially we only have 2 All Seeds, 2 Anointeds. Another way you can do this without hitting the craft thing, you just want to see things you don't own, is go into the filters and click not collected and maybe take off collected, and this will essentially allow us to look at our collection and see all the cards we don't have. I don't know why it reset, but now we can scroll through and just see all these cards we don't have. So if you're looking to build a deck, you can actually, you know, look at a card. Let's just say we want to add a Luminarch Aspirant to this deck. We can actually click the card we don't own, and we drag it over to our list, and it'll actually essentially just add it to the list, even if we don't own it. So we can just add cards to our list that we may want to add to our deck, and then at some point when we get the wild cards, we can go ahead and craft it. Now my final and last tip, this one's kind of more of like my way of when it comes about, you know, thinking when it comes to MTG Arena and crafting as a whole. And this definitely helps a newer player or a player on a budget, is I wouldn't go out of my way just to craft particular cards just because they may be the card that's in currently. Let's just say you like Tybalt's Trickery. It's a card that is a very good card in a way that when it works, but there's a lot of times when it doesn't work. And I would say that's kind of like a fad card. I haven't seen it as much when I've been playing it in the arena as a whole. And I would say I wouldn't go out of my way to craft that if I can't either complete the deck or it's a card that may or may not see, you know, extended play or competitive play at some point. Sure, it's a fun card to play, you know, maybe among some friends and things like that, but I wouldn't go out of my way to craft that card unless you're really focused in on playing that particular deck. The other thing too is that it doesn't hurt to just save wild cards and use them as you need. Sometimes it's great to complete a collection of, you know, all the new pathway lands and just have them all, but if you're not playing the lands, you're just, you know, you just wasted wild cards on lands you're not playing currently, and then you know, when you move on to your next deck and you need some particular rares, you just wasted all your rares on a wild card. So I would say if you're on a budget and you really can't, you know, buy tons of packs to kind of replenish your wild cards, I would say use them as you need or save them until you have, you know, enough to build a new deck before you start spending them on building up your collection. With that being said, guys, if you like this video, it definitely helps out a lot by hitting that like button. It lets me know that you guys want to see more videos like this. If you're new here, want to know post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But I appreciate you guys watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.